Welcome to In-Depth with Joseph G, a weekly program running every Wednesday at this hour. Today's topic will be the West's twisted prism, or rather distorted prism, Tigray versus Ukraine. The subject matter of this essay will be examining the nature of that prism. By that prism, I mean the prism through which the West has been looking and responding to the Tigray crisis, and the factors that have rendered it twisted or distorted. We will look at each one of these factors below. But before I delve into the subject matter in detail, let me mention that when it comes to the Ukraine crisis, I'm not going to look at it in detail for obvious reasons, because this is not the subject matter. The focus of the subject matter is not Ukraine. The Ukraine crisis will only be mentioned as a form of contrast that keeps highlighting the nature of the Tigray crisis and the way the West has been responding to that crisis. Okay, so let's look at those factors one by one. I'm sure many of you have heard of commentators, especially from the South, and I mean, when I say from the South, I mean from the developing world, pointing their finger at the West and accusing the US and the European nations of double standards and of hypocrisy when it comes to dealing with crises similar to the Ukraine that has been occurring in the developing world. When it comes to Tigray, two kinds of accusations have been leveled against the West. The one has to do with a lack of attention, or that not enough attention has been paid to the Tigray crisis, especially when after the Ukrainian crisis has emerged. The other one is, of course, of racism, and let me say a few words in regard to these two. First of all, nobody in his right mind should expect equal attention to be given to the two crises. That is, given the enormous strategic importance of Ukraine to the West, and in addition, given to the huge global consequences that would surely follow the outcome of the war in Ukraine. But I believe the accusers have not missed this point. They are not saying that the Tigray crisis and the Ukraine crisis should get enough attention, equal attention. They are not stupid enough to demand that. What they are saying is that the level of attention when it comes to Tigray is so abysmally low that it amounts to no attention at all, or even to negative attention. The same is true in regard to racism. When Dr. Tedros Adhanom of WHO points at the same problem, at the way racism has tainted, at the way the West has been looking at similar crises in the developing world, when he is mentioning that he's not simply wishing that that racism would go away. That would be impossible to achieve. This is a state of mind that has sedimented through hundreds of years. The problem now is that the racism that has been working in the background has actually come in the at the foreground. The difference in the way the Tigray crisis and the Ukraine crisis has been treated is so glaringly huge that nobody would miss the racism factor in this, in the way the West is looking at these two crises. But, and this is a big but, in this essay, what I'm trying to point out is that it goes beyond these two factors. That is to say, the West is not only becoming, it's not only part of the solution in this crisis, but it's also becoming part of the problem. So much so that it is shaping the very nature of the crisis itself. The factors that I want to mention has to do, all of them has to do with the self-interest of the West in that region, in the Horn of Africa. Let me mention 4 of them. One is European Union's migration policy. Europe has been looking at the Horn of Africa mainly through its migration policy. It will do anything it can to prevent, let's say, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people migrating from that region to Europe. So much so that at this point in time, it has de facto, although unspoken, agreed with the evil axis. By the evil axis, I mean the Ethiopian, Amhara, and Eritrean forces occupying Western Tigray. If that could prevent the migration of tens of thousands of Tigrayans making it all the way to Europe, then the EU wouldn't mind that. The second one is the US obsession with terrorism in that region. The US policy of terrorism is also closely linked with the stability and unity, quote unquote, the stability and unity of Ethiopia. That by itself would have been okay had it not further been linked, that stability and unity, with the Abiy administration. At this point in time, the US doesn't see any alternative to the Abiy administration. It believes it is the only entity that could keep the stability and the unity of Ethiopia intact. You could see easily how it is connected with the terrorism problem. If Ethiopia's stability and unity is undermined, then the probability that that region would be a haven of terrorists would be great. Although these links are false, these links are wrong, that's exactly what the United States believes. And that has affected the way it's looking at the Tigray crisis right now. It prioritizes Ethiopia's stability over the concerns of genocide in Tigray. The third one is geopolitical considerations to the same effect. That area is very sensitive, that being the crossroads of in between, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, given all the strategic value of that area, that also prioritizes Ethiopia over Tigray. Of course, Ethiopia's again, quote-unquote, unity and stability of Ethiopia over the genocidal forces in around Tigray. The last one is the trade, again with China as its competitor in mind, given that Ethiopia has a population of 120 million, and it's believed to be emerging to be a huge market. Both the US and the Europeans are looking at it from their own self-interest. Again, all of these four factors have made it impossible for the West to look at the Tigrayan crisis as it is. Every time these interests are factored in, the prism through which they look at the Tigray crisis gets more and more distorted. Okay, so let's look at how it gets distorted and below in regard to the humanitarian crisis, the refugee problem, and the war itself, particularly the arms supply. Let's look at two factors. The first one is naming it. By naming it, I mean identifying the problem. Unless you identify the problem, then you couldn't address the problem itself. When it comes to Tigray, there is no doubt in my mind that what's happening inside Tigray right now is genocide. The genocidal regimes have been encircling Tigray, sealing it off from the outside world, and denying it any kind of service from entering Tigray. That includes medicine, food, fuel, and all other kinds of services. It's clear that this is genocide. Actually, hundreds of thousands of people have already died precisely because they couldn't get, because of lack of medicine, lack of food, and lack of cash, lack of some other services. Yet the UN, for example, let alone to recognize it as, to acknowledge that genocide is taking place in Tigray, it doesn't even admit that famine exists. The International Criminal Court, so far there is not even a beep when it comes to the genocide in Tigray. To the contrary, when it comes to Ukraine, we have seen a flurry of activities from the UN and the ICC from the very beginning. When it comes to the Biden administration, it didn't take it even weeks for Biden to name what's happening in Ukraine as genocide. I remember the day he said it, the number of civilian deaths in Ukraine only amounted only in hundreds. Yet, when it comes to Tigray, where the number have reached hundreds of thousands, literally, talk about exchange rate. The exchange rate between the populations, it seems that for every one Ukrainian death, it's almost 1,000 Tigrayan deaths. Yet, the Biden administration is very reluctant to name the Tigrayan humanitarian crisis as genocide, precisely because it wants to save the Abiy government. Now, how do they address the problem? Of course, in the Ukrainian case, it's obvious. Tens of billions of dollars worth of aid, money and material aid, I'm talking about money and material aid, has been flowing in the case of Ukraine. Whereas in Tigray, the way they are responding in fact, this is where the twisted prism works at its best. It's almost borders towards the evil. I am not accusing the West now of providing less aid, even proportionally, less aid to Tigray. That's not the problem, because so far the West has provided more than $1 billion of worth of aid to Tigray. When it comes to the African standard, that is a huge amount. But here is a twist. The West doesn't give a damn where this officially given aid to Tigray ends up. Not even 5% of that aid reaches the population of Tigray. More than 95% of that aid that is supposed to reach the population of Tigray ends up in the hands of the genocidal regime. That is the Abiy government itself. And the West doesn't seem to mind it. In fact, to the contrary, what it does is it tries to collaborate. It collaborates with the genocidal regime in the theatrics it creates in simulating the Ethiopian magnanimity when it comes to Tigray. Notice, for example, every time a single convoy, let's say in a month's time, where they are supposed to have provided every day a convoy of 100 trucks, now we are talking about a single convoy in 1 month or 2 months with, let's say, 20 or 40 trucks, making it all the way from Samara to Tigray. The United Nations, the disgraceful departments of the United Nations like OCHA and WFP, the first thing that they do is they conduct this amazing advertisement for the Abiy regime in Addis Ababa by proclaiming to the whole world that the coming day a convoy of aid will be making it from Samara to Mekelle. The next day they will be ready with their videos showing us these trucks moving from Samara, following it all the way to Mekelle. I always wonder, why would they want to do this thing every time this thing happens? And of course, every time they do that, it's followed instantly. For example, the last time this has been done, the UN, especially with this Ethiophile leader Antonio Guterres, the friend of Abiy himself, and its departments, it's always is followed up by commendation for the Abiy government, that it's allowing this kind of aid entering to Tigray. And then follows the US State Department. The most notorious of them is the United Kingdom, which came up lately that a cessation of hostility has been achieved and that aid is flowing to Tigray. An announcement that says that aid is flowing right now to Tigray. So in every one case, what they keep doing is that they keep collaborating with the Abiy government in making it seem as if the Abiy government is fully involved in its task of allowing aid flow to Tigray. Why do they keep doing that? I believe they realize, the West realizes, that all the aid that it has been providing to Tigray has ended up in the hands of the genocidal regime. So if they are to try to cover it up by making it seem as if the Abiy government, that genocidal regime, is actually providing aid to Tigray. One example of that would be if they really wanted to avoid the hurdles that the Abiy government has been giving them. One thing that you could have done is provide, cargo shipments, air cargo shipments to Tigray, but they are not demanding to do that. The other thing is, for example, providing cash. I'm not talking about the Abiy government providing cash, but the donor nations to provide, to give some of that aid, not only in kind but in cash, especially to the people of the people in Tigray who has been primarily the victim of famine because they have been, what's happening in Tigray right now is the main victim of the encirclement of Tigray are not the peasants but the urban salaried workers. For example, there are 80,000 pensioners that are no more being paid by the Abiy government. There are 200,000 salaried government workers that are no more getting any money from the government, and their all banking accounts also have been frozen. So one way of dealing with this problem would have been for the providers, the donors, to provide these people with a small amount of money, but they are not even trying to do that. So anyway, notice how the prism getting twisted when addressing the humanitarian problem in Tigray. Especially in the West, conscious inattention. Conscious inattention sounds to be oxymoron, but actually it is not, because they know that the inattention that they are paying to the crisis, to the humanitarian crisis, is more or less deliberate as to where their aid ends up, and of course in covering up the traces through active collaboration with the regime. Now let's look at the refugee problem and look at that twisted prism again, on how that twisted prism works again. The refugees problem in Tigray and Ukraine. When it comes to Ukraine, there is no hiding the fact that the extent of the refugee problem has been huge. Already more than 5 million people have left the country, and we are still counting. And when it comes to Tigray, only 70,000 of them have made it to Sudan. Now, at first appearance, it seems that the comparison is favors the Ukrainian one, given the huge refugee numbers. But appearances are deceiving. When it comes to Ukraine, we see three positive things, despite the huge humanitarian tragedy. First of all, no one is preventing the Ukrainians from leaving the country, not even the Russians. In fact, humanitarian corridors are open many times in collaboration with Russia. And when it comes to their destination point, they are being welcomed with open arms in the neighboring countries. Now, let's look at Tigray. Tigray, according to me, is the biggest concentration camp in the world right now. The fact that there are no barbed wires and formidable walls surrounding it shouldn't deceive us to the obvious fact. That is, that more than 500,000 soldiers from Ethiopia, Amhara, Eritrea, and Afar has surrounded Tigray. They have sealed off the nation. No one is allowed to get in or out. And that is precisely what the aim has been. The victims of this genocide are the entire Tigrayan population. And that is the population that these enemies are trying to wipe out from the face of the earth. Already, hundreds of thousands of them have died due to war, lack of medicine, and lack of food. Now, there is no humanitarian corridor, unlike the case of Ukraine, where even the Russians are collaborating in creating human corridors for the people that want to live. In Tigray, there is no such humanitarian corridor. If there was such a humanitarian corridor, millions of Tigrayans now would have escaped this genocide to reach Sudan. But the problem is the entire region is sealed off from the surrounding areas. Now, what has been the role by the West in the encirclement of Tigray? I've already mentioned their role in Western Tigray, but let me make it clear here. The West, especially the European Union, is trying to prevent a mass migration from Tigray and Ethiopia as a result of the ongoing Ethio-Tigrayan crisis. But now mainly it's focusing on Tigray because that's where the potential, let's say hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands trying to reach Europe would come from. We could look at how the the EU and the United States responded regarding to the crisis in western part of Tigray. At the beginning, both of them have been very vocal in their demands that the Ethiopian, the Eritrean, and the Amhara forces should withdraw from western Tigray. And that is for legitimate reasons. Western Tigray turned out to be the area where the greatest killing fields in Ethiopia has been taking place. More than 1 million Tigrayans or Tigrinya-speaking people have been ethnically cleansed from that area, and tens of thousands have been massacred in that area. And the massacre, the genocide is still going on. But it didn't take long after that for both the United States and the EU, especially the EU, to change their tunes. What happened in between? Well, they happened to make a big discovery. That in fact, the occupation of Western Tigray by the genocidal team, that is the Eritrean, Ethiopian, and Amhara forces, is what is holding on the refugees from the millions of potential refugees from making it all the way to Sudan. In fact, it is this axis of evil that is preventing the floodgates from opening by occupying Western Tigray. So in actuality, what the European Union have discovered was that it found out that the genociders are actually doing them a big favor by blocking these refugees. Because they are afraid out of the millions that would reach Sudan, probably hundreds of thousands, or at minimum tens of thousands, would make their way to Europe. And even if they don't succeed in making their way to Europe, that there is no way of preventing them from applying asylum in the refugee camps in Sudan and eventually reaching Europe and the US, because these are clear victims of genocide. Okay. The other one is that the fear that the other part of the refugee problem that the European Union fears is if the destabilization of Ethiopia continues, and if eventually the disintegration of Ethiopia takes place, millions of refugees, more than the number that it's afraid right now, that could come out from the Tigrayan crisis, that millions of refugees will probably head towards Europe. So, according to them, if Tigray secedes, if Tigray becomes an independent nation, and the only way it could happen if Tigray eventually gains its western Tigray, then the destabilization of Ethiopia will happen. The disintegration of Ethiopia would follow. I do believe that this kind of this logic is flawed. I actually believe it's the other way around. It's holding on to Tigray by force that will cause the destabilization and the disintegration of Ethiopia, which is actually happening right now. The Abiy government is the cause of the destabilization of Tigray. But so far, the West has failed to make a link between the Abiy government and the destabilization of Ethiopia. So for them, though, it means that in order to prevent the bigger refugee problem from Ethiopia, they will have to prevent Tigray from seceding from Ethiopia. And the only way to do that is prevent Tigray from gaining Western Tigray. So in actuality, what the European Union and the US have been doing right now is they have entered a Faustian deal with the axis of evil that I have mentioned before, the combined, the allied forces of Ethiopia, Amhara, and Eritrea. In order to stop the flow of refugees from both Tigray and Ethiopia, they have found it necessary to block Tigray from achieving Western Tigray. Now you could easily see that how that twisted prison has been working in the refugee problem in Tigray, while no such thing is happening in the case of Ukraine. Now let's look at the last factor, that is the armaments, or the armaments factor, or the arms supply factor. This is in regard to armaments or arms supply. In the case of Ukraine, again, it's obvious. Tens of billions of dollars worth of arms supply has been flowing to Ukraine. When it comes to Tigray, it just happens to be the opposite. If there is any people in this world that should claim a bragging right to courage, it would be the Tigrayan army that has been able to defeat the allied arms of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Amhara, and even the drones of UAE by arming itself from the enemy. It has been capturing not only tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, but also the entire army supply that it gets is from has been captured from enemy sources. Now, if you look at the only at the casualty that it has inflicted on the Ethiopian army, only on the federal army. It was more than 300,000 dead and hundreds of thousands more wounded. And this is using the enemy's arms supply. Okay, now here is a twist that usually the twisted prism that we have been talking about. One of the reasons why the West is in cahoots, let's say, knowingly or unknowingly, with the Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara allies in sealing off the border with Sudan, is to deny the TDF, the Tigrayan Defense Force, any military supply. This is how their logic goes. If the Tigrayan army has been able to defeat this axis of evil forces, which amounted in hundreds of thousands of soldiers, through their own army, through their own arms, then imagine what the 2DF could do if it gets a supply, an army supply from the outside world. So it's essential that they stop that, while the genocidal regime is getting all the army it needed, in fact, from global sources, you could say. Russia, China has been arming it, mainly through UAE, Saudi Arabia, who has been financing, not only financing, but also providing drones as in case of UAE. And then there is Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan. Even Ukraine has been siding with these forces in order to attack Tigray. And much more importantly, the West, despite the sanctions that it has imposed on Ethiopia, has been the main financier. The West has been providing almost every year the United Nations more than $1 billion and a similar amount of money from the EU. And most of that money has been still flowing to Ethiopia. So for all practical purposes, it is the West that has been financing the Ethiopian war, in addition to the Saudi Arabian and UAE. While Tigray, in the Tigrayan case, as I has been explaining before, not even a single bullet, Tigray hasn't received not even a single bullet from outside forces. All its army supply has been from the enemy, the allied enemies that I have been mentioning before. Okay, now we have to look at the purpose of the war from the eyes of Tigray. Tigray is conducting this war in order to break out of the siege that has been imposed on it. The siege means the genocide that has been going on. If it is to prevent the genocide, it has to break out from the siege conducted by the enemy forces. Now, there are only two ways that Tigray could do this. One is by reaching Addis Ababa, if it can, by reaching Addis Ababa, ousting the regime, and install a friendly regime. Then not only its existential problem, but in addition, Ethiopia's problem would be solved. But that has been a no-no from the West. The West doesn't want the Tigrayan forces to reach Addis Ababa, and we have seen it, how they have done it. When a few months ago, the Tigrayan defense forces managed to reach the gates of Addis Ababa, the West panicked. When it comes to the US, not only did it threaten the TPLF leadership, now it has become clear by one of the generals from Tigrayan generals, that not only did it threaten the TPLF leadership, but the US also made it clear to them that it would make it difficult for them to govern the nation if they entered Addis Ababa. But and more importantly, more tangibly, it gave a green light to the forces, the Middle Eastern forces like United Arab Emirates and Turkey, to provide Ethiopia with fleets of drones to ward off the march of TDF towards Addis Ababa, to stop the march of TDF towards Addis Ababa. At minimum, what it did at that time was it made it clear to this force that it would be no more opposing them if they use their drones to attack the TDF. And that is exactly what happened. So the combined threats of the US and the drones did the job of turning the TDF all the way from Shawa to Tigray. So in a sense, what the West did at this is, or at least what the US did was prevent the Tigrayan forces from breaking out from their siege in taking the road to Addis Ababa. The other way they could have broken the siege is by going all the way by opening the western corridor through West Tigray to the Sudanese border. And we have already seen how the US and the EU have conspired for that not to happen. In fact, that they have conspired with, whether knowingly or not, whether spoken or not, with the evil axis of Ethiopian, Amhara, and Eritrean forces in occupying Western Tigray. So both of them have been they are preventing. Literally, what the West has been doing so far is preventing the Tigrayan forces from breaking out from their siege. In a sense, they have been helping the Abiy regime in encirclement of Tigray, whether they deliberately meant to do that or not. They have ended up helping the Abiy regime in encircling Tigray. Again, we have seen how that twisted prism has ended up in doing, how the West has ended up in doing the bidding of the evil axis when it comes in encircling and starving out Tigray. Okay, now to the conclusion. Let's look again. Let's go back at the hypocrisy and see the invisibility of Tigray. In conclusion, let me revisit the subject matter of hypocrisy that I have raised at the beginning of this essay, in order to make intangible the extent of Tigray's invisibility in our world. We have already seen the West's hypocrisy in regard to that, but this hypocrisy exists even among those who accuse the West of hypocrisy. I have carefully noted many commentators who have been doing this, and invariably, all of them, the nations that they mention vis-a-vis Ukraine, are all in the Middle East. They start with Afghanistan, then of course Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and West, and they invariably end with Palestine. None of them ever mention Tigray, even though, as Dr. Tedros Adhanom of WHO have at one time mentioned that the greatest tragedy right now in our world is existing in Tigray. This hypocrisy is also crystal clear when it comes among Pan-Africanists, always ally with Ethiopia, no matter what, whatever it does, because of the myth that it has created among them, the myth of the only black African nation that defeated a white army. So much so that they couldn't even see when that very nation is committing genocide supposedly among its own people. For the Pan-Africanists, a humanitarian crisis occurs only when it is white versus black, and not when it is black versus black. For example, as in the case of Rwanda, the Hutu versus Tutsi case. This is the case even among African American activists. Let me mention the case of that controversial case of argument that happened, I don't know, maybe a year ago, between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cornel West. Cornel West accuses, these are two giant intellectuals of Black America. Cornel West accused Ta-Nehisi Coates at one time of not being global enough in his analysis, of not situating the African American crisis in the USA globally, of not connecting it with other crises like he often mentions Palestine or Cuba or Venezuela. Now the problem is not Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was humble enough to admit that he is not knowledgeable enough about these cases to do what Cornel West is asking him to do. That's why he simply focuses on the African American crisis without connecting it with what's happening in the outside world. But the hypocrisy is in Cornel West himself. Again, whenever he mentions these global cases, it's always Palestine, Cuba, and so on, or South Africa when it comes to Black Africans, because that South African case is clearly connected with the white world. But when it comes to black versus black, he doesn't seem to care that much. I suspect that Cornel West knows exactly what is going on in Ethiopia right now, precisely because his wife is, I'm not sure that she is no longer, I'm not sure whether she is right now she is his wife, but at one time I know that he has been married to an Ethiopian woman. Therefore, I believe that he's knowledgeable of what is going on right now in Ethiopia. But you wouldn't hear even a word coming out from his mouth in regarding to the crisis in Tigray, to the genocide in Tigray, while he is pointing his fingers at all those crises that traps, the US in the wrong way, Palestine, Venezuela, South Africa, and so forth, or Zimbabwe, and so forth. Anyway, all that I'm trying to do is that when it comes even to the invisibility of Tigray in the stratification that the world has created, Tigray finds this itself at the bottom, even though the greatest crisis, the greatest tragedy right now is taking place in Tigray. Thank you.